Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking your lunch hour to talk a little bit about security. Really excited with what we have to present today, and we've got one of our strategic partners with us, Zoe, and I'll let her introduce herself in a second here. But a couple quick items before we jump into it. First of all, I want to let everyone know that this session will be recorded and the slides will be available after the presentation. So we can get those out to you, and you can contact your representative if you don't get those from us. I also want to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout. I don't think we're going to take quite the full hour today, so please ask questions. We'll address them as they come up. We'll also have plenty of time at the end to cover anything outstanding that we didn't get to throughout the presentation. So again, with that, really excited to have Zoe from Duo joining us today. And Zoe, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. I'm really excited to take you through a walkthrough of Zero Trust Access. Quick introduction to me. My name is Zoe Lindsay. I'm a security strategist at Duo. I'm a longtime member of the Duo team. I joined in 2012. And so in my time with the company, I've gotten to talk about access security with a ton of organizations, folks at just about every level, from help desk analyst to CIO and just about every industry, though I will be the first to tell you that I am less polished in public education and federal than most of the private sector. In that time, I've gotten to learn a lot about what works for folks as they go through this kind of zero trust evolution. And so I'm excited today to get to share some of that with you. Now, you'll note it's right in the title there, and I'm probably going to say it about 100 times today. We are going to be talking a good deal about zero trust. Before I even go to the next slide, I want to give everybody a caveat. When I'm talking about zero trust, I'm talking about a methodology or a philosophy, a paradigm, a framework, whatever you want to call it. Zero trust is an approach, not a solution in and of itself. So today we're going to be talking about a zero trust methodology applied to secure access. And as we go through the deck, I'll talk about why I think that access is a great place to focus your first attention. But I want to clarify that Duo is not the vendor of zero trust. Zero trust is not a SKU or a product that you can buy. I just want to clarify that because I feel like a lot of times in presentations that can get muddied, and we can talk about zero trust as kind of a general purpose magic buzzword, and that's not the way that we're positioning it here. Today, we're talking about zero trust in the context of solving for an evolution of our networks. If we take a very extremely simplified version of the traditional perimeterized network, it might look something like this. We've got a local network with our machines connected. We have our administrative, our user directory, and our productivity tools like email and Office. Behind a perimeter firewall that helps protect outside access from the internet and enforce a group of policy rules to enforce our security strategy and make sure that only the users intended are accessing resources. You may also know this as the M&M model, crunchy on the outside, soft and gooey on the inside. Now, obviously, as time progressed, we needed options for folks to connect remotely. And so we kept much of this perimeterized model, but added a layer of VPN access where external devices that were properly configured could be used to dial back into that protected internal network, subject to all of the same rules and policies enforced by the firewall for those local machines. Now, that can help address the problem of enforcing access rules, but it introduces some new problems of its own of those external machines now potentially being more vulnerable pivot points for access to the network. But more specifically, we're looking at the fact that it doesn't address our use cases for other machines that haven't been custom configured, such as user-owned devices and smart devices like smartphones and tablets. As time went on, we saw adoption of this cloud-forward technology first happen in the consumer space. But as time goes on, as those solutions matured and evolved, as they were made to address the needs of business and enterprise, we saw growing adoption of them by business. The reason being that these users want the same accessibility and convenience that they have in the rest of their life when they're coming to work. So the challenge that we find ourselves at is as time goes on, not only those user devices, but even the administrative tools, the productivity tools, the user directory tools have moved outside of our perimeter. And so now we really have to deal with a hybrid environment to consider. While we have great, well-tested, decades-long solutions for protecting that traditional environment, the question then becomes, how do you address all of these new elements that are happening outside of your environment, not just devices, but even applications and tools hosted in the cloud that you have more limited access and control over? So when we talk about the shift in the IT landscape and our expanded perimeter, we really need to take into account not only remote users and personal devices, but IoT devices, cloud applications, hybrid infrastructure, cloud infrastructure. And now, as we're dealing with a primarily remote workforce, we have to think of this element of, I call it inherited IT. It's not so much shadow IT that your users are introducing and working around the policies of, but more the devices and networks that your users are operating from when they're at home that now are unavoidably connected to corporate resources. How do you protect and defend against potential attacks targeting those? Now, it's not a matter of whether or not there's solutions available. Quite the opposite. There's a ton of tools available to address kind of each individual element of this problem, and then several more overarching solutions that are taking a more holistic approach to try and address several elements at once. The goal really should be to minimize the feeds of data so that you can focus on the signal and eliminate as much noise as possible. So as close as we're going to get to FUD, we just got through it. Don't worry. Now we're going to take a look at what we can do about it. If we look at our attack models today, they don't focus so much on the individual machine or the network to establish a foothold and pivot as much as they focus directly on the data and the identity with access to the data that they are ultimately after. This is one of the major pivots that we see as attacks have expanded outside of the perimeter to also target these cloud services. In those instances, the user identity really is the key to the kingdom for access. And so this is going to leverage those points that are a more direct path to that which they want in order to exploit or sell. These attacks on user identity or machines will typically go through phishing or increasingly ransomware channels. We saw a decrease in ransomware several years back, and then it has just gone gangbusters over COVID. It's definitely grown both in the size and frequency of ransoms demanded. So if we look at the common pathways that these attacks are coming in, first thing is we can take a look and talk about passwords. Now, passwords go all the way back to the den of thieves and Aladdin trying to get in the door. That passphrase idea has been with us for literally centuries. But in the context of information technology, the first password was introduced, I believe, at MIT in 1962. I don't have my speaker notes in front of me, so please forgive me if it was 61 or 63. Within a year, however, the first passwords had already been cracked, as researchers who needed more time and access to systems discovered that there was a single text file that included all user passwords, and they could use them during downtime to get more access. So the problem with passwords is that they are a tool that are better fit for systems than they are for human brains, right? We see that reflected in the problems that we see throughout organizations. 20 to 50% of all IT help desk calls each year are for password related issues, whether those are resets, lockouts, etc. $1 million is the average cost of password-related support per U.S. organization. So across the country, an average cost per organization in the U.S. Annually is $1 million in password-related resets and support. And there's a huge number of accounts that we're dealing with. You may have 1,400 applications in use across the average enterprise, 190 or more average passwords that users are trying to manage. I saw recent research that said that on average, a user will access up to 35 accounts in a given day. And we know that for these to be effective, because there are a vast variety of attacks that are targeted at user credentials, the most common of which in the last several years being these massive password breaches. If we take a look at something like the Rocky 21 file that was dropped, there was something like 8 billion passwords in that file. There's only 7 some odd billion people on the planet Earth. So that should give you an idea that odds are your users have multiple accounts out there that at some point have been compromised. And if those passwords are in use elsewhere, they could be vulnerable. That is not to say for all of the other methods that can target either directories, that can target specific machines, or try and trick that user into entering their password through a spear phishing or a more generalized phishing attack. So we got more and more complicated. We optimized this process even further for systems and even less functionally for human beings, because now we're trying to increase complexity. We say you need 8 or more characters, and now I would say it's more like 12 to 16 characters at a minimum. You want to include numbers, uppercase characters, lowercase characters, special characters, rotate them every 60 days, 90 days, 180 days. This is functionally impossible for human beings. Unless you're Dominic O'Brien or somebody with one of those magic memories that can memorize a deck of cards flipping through it, this is not a good solution for you. So we added something to help increase security while maintaining usability, multi-factor authentication. You're very familiar with this. I would hope the idea of taking something you know, such as a username and password, pairing it with something you have or something that you are in the instance of a biometric method. Now, there's a wide variety of MFA methods supported out there. You've got your push, phone callback, SMS passcodes, soft token, which you may be familiar with, if not through Duo, through something like Google Authenticator, where you can tap that account and it'll give you a passcode to enter. Newer standards like U2F tokens, that newer web-based standard championed by the FIDO Alliance, hardware tokens, biometric methods, as well as wearables like Apple Watch and Android Wear OS. A robust solution like Duos will try and support as many of these options as possible, and then give you as administrators the ability to constrain those based on your security strategy and needs. Now, why is there such a focus? Why did I say earlier that access is one of the key points to look at as you look to implement a zero trust philosophy? It's because if we look for common elements in breach access, almost always we are looking at the elements of weak or stolen user credentials, or a breach that is originating at that endpoint, either through a device-based exploit or through something like a man-in-the-middle attack. So we can ask ourselves, if we're looking to reduce the most risk with the least effort, how do you stop attacks that use stolen but legitimate credentials? And how do you prevent devices with poor security hygiene from accessing critical applications? So this is really the problem that Zero Trust was conceptualized to address. Conversation started in 2007 with the Jericho Forum, where we had a variety of international organizations put their heads together and say, okay, we're seeing a change in how we're networking and how we're accessing resources. How do we get in front of it? And so the idea was, how do we talk about a deperimeterized future? Then in 2010, this idea evolved as John Kindervag, then with Forrester Research, introduced Zero Trust as a methodology. He's often known as the father of Zero Trust. And then really one of the first large-scale implementations of this framework was Google's BeyondCorp project, which took several years as they went throughout their entire organization, trying to implement Zero Trust-based solutions at every level of the security strategy. Fortunately, they provided really useful feedback as they went through this process to help other organizations, and I would highly recommend looking up and taking a look at those white papers. I want to mention one of the biggest takeaways, which we're going to touch on again, in their retrospective paper coming out in 2017, where they said that one of the biggest predictors of the success or difficulty in a rollout was the consistency and preparatory education given to the users. If there was a change that was well communicated to the users, or their login experience did not change, it went smoothly. if there were multiple methods that users had to use to log into different services, or if they weren't adequately prepared and this change came as a surprise to them, then they saw a much higher incidence of help desk tickets, delays, and issues. Now, when we talk about zero trust, I think one of the things that often happens is that we think of trust as, do we trust our users? But really, we are talking about, in the context of access, we're thinking about zero trust. We're treating every access attempt as if it is originating from an untrusted network. So we are solving for the least secure potential access scenario, somebody coming in from outside of our perimeterized network and not subject to those policies or controls implemented by our firewall and other perimeterized security tools. So zero trust does not mean a lack of trust. Zero trust does not mean that you look sideways at your users, give them the stink eye every day when they're coming in. Instead, it means that the network no longer infers trust. We are established that each time that a user connects. So what this means at the point of access is not only are we validating that user through a strong second factor through MFA, but we are also looking at the other elements of that access attempt. So first step, baseline, if you're not using MFA everywhere, please do. If you take one takeaway from this conversation, let it be to use MFA everywhere that you have sensitive data. But then we want to move past that and look at the trustworthiness of that device. We know that there's some really basic security hygiene steps that we can take to greatly reduce the risk of an exploited device. We do that by first having visibility on the health of that device, and then through access policies, enforcing some control as to whether or not we want to grant access. Then, after addressing our key use cases, we expand to cover all of our key applications. And finally, as we have a increased amount of historical telemetry, we can use that to get really smart and use analytics to even further filter down what could represent more risky access attempts. Now, not all access methods provide the same level of security. I would encourage you to take a look at this research done by Stanford in conjunction with Google security team, where they look at the successful rate of automated and targeted attacks based on different multi-factor methods. You'll see that by far the most effective method was a unique device-based prompt. When I say unique and device-based, the way that we are distinguishing that from something like a hardware token or a soft token, this is using a shared seed secret. This means that the passcode generated on that device, a smartphone for soft token, a hardware token on a hardware token, is being matched either by the iteration of events or amount of time elapsed against a seed file on the server side. If you recall, there was a very large token-based breach about 10 years ago, and that was the vulnerability targeted, was that the vendor's seed files were targeted, rendering those tokens no longer effective. When we're talking about a specific device-based challenge, we're talking about something like push, where rather than that shared seed secret, we're doing a public key encrypted communication, where the public key for your Duo integration is prompting a query that is being answered by your device, which has a private key certificate generated on it at the time that it's enrolled and stored in the HSM. So this really, when I say varies widely, I'm talking about 10% effectiveness for knowledge-based questions, which arguably isn't really multi-factor, since it's now taking something you know, your password, and adding to it something you know, your knowledge question. But up to 94% or more blocked by those specific device-based challenges. Then we want to look at the trustworthiness of device. Look at that basic device hygiene information and ideally gather it based on what telemetry is already there. On mobile devices with Duo, we're gathering this from the developer permissions, same developer permissions that apply to any other app installed on a user's device. So there is no agent that needs to be deployed or sideloaded. That is allowing you to see what's the screen lock status on that device. If it's lost, is somebody going to be able to pick it up and access data on it? Has it been rooted or jailbroken? Has the OS been tampered with? Is it an up-to-date OS? We know that nearly every vulnerability out there has a patch available. This is a simple measure of economics. It is economically feasible for attackers to attack in bulk with affordable exploits. Affordable exploits are those that patches are available for, but very often can still be successful because many devices will be out of date. So just by making sure that the mobile OS and the laptop or desktop OS are up to date, the browsers are up to date, that troublemaking plugins or even end of life now plugins like Flash and Java are disabled, you can establish a lot just from this basic security hygiene gathered from the developer permissions, from the user agent on browser-based applications, or the user installable Duo Device Health application available through the App Store for various OSs. Once you've got that visibility, if we take security down to its most basic elements, we need to see what's going on and we need to do something about it, right? So we can enforce device policy based on checking against all of those detailed telemetry data points that we just talked about. And then we can really get granular in that policy by defining our minimum bar, our global minimum standard across the organization, and then get more granular because not every tool is the same, not every user has the same level of access. So then we can get more specific with tool-based or even group or user-based policies. Now, why do we want to have a variety of access methods available? Why do we want to potentially have areas of our environment that are less strictly governed than the key or critical tools within our environment? It's because we know that usability supports good security. We talk about security through the CIA acronym, confidentiality, integrity, availability. But if we think about it, a perfect security tool that your users don't understand or can't properly interact with doesn't provide you with effective security. And I like to illustrate this with a data point from one of our trusted access reports from several years back. We found that devices that supported a biometric method as an opt-out part of enrollment when setting up a new device had 93% enrollment for a lock screen on those user devices, while only 78% of devices that supported a PIN or a passcode alone had that same measure in place. Now, if we talk about absolute risk is going up on that biometric supported device because you still need that password, PIN, or pattern as a backup in case the biometric doesn't function. There's now 2 potential points of failure. But if we look at the likely risk, the much likelier risk than somebody individually tracking down your user and making them authenticate to their phone by pressing their finger on it, is that device being lost or stolen, unsecured, picked up, and now either by hook, by crook, by purpose or accident, that data being leaked. Then we need to expand. We want to protect throughout our environment, not just our key use cases, but anywhere that sensitive data is stored. While it is less of a focus of attack, pivot attacks are still very real. Compromised user accounts, they're more likely to have a shared identity or shared password with other corporate accounts. So we do want to expand and cover all of those use cases. Finally, as we gather more of that telemetry, we want to examine that activity, that user device activity, and detect anomalies. Find users that are logging in at unusual times, that are suddenly using much different, more out-of-date devices. If there's a sudden spike of out-of-date endpoints, these things you can use to trigger security events that'll prioritize your admin's response so they can focus their attention on what's most important first. Now, a common topic that folks are talking about as they're doing this risk assessment, as they're revising their security strategy, they've got an eye towards how they're going to handle the topic of cyber liability insurance. I think that there is nothing that is driving this conversation so heavily as the increase in both risk and potential loss from these ransomware attacks. These insurance policies, which differ based on the insurer that you go with, can provide a variety of coverage against potential cyber attacks, which could include ransomware, data breach, or network-based damage. Cyber liability insurance is going to notify the impacted parties. They will help you with having your disaster recovery and response plans. They may potentially hire a PR firm even to help with this triage. Oftentimes, they will help provide services in terms of evaluating and advising on fixes for security flaws and the potential to recover expenses so that you can continue your business operations. But a key element in these conversations, one that will determine both your eligibility and likely policy rates, is your risk assessment. And one of the most common required measures in place that you'll see across most insurers is having broad multi-factor adoption across your environment. Some other additional controls, because I don't want to portray the idea that this is the only element you want to focus on first, is data backup and recovery, which is especially key in the course of ransomware attacks, RDP access, endpoint detection not in place, and then also employee training, user education. Again, going back to that Google feedback, we know that's one of the biggest predictors of a success is preparing your users for what they're going to have to do to help maintain security measures.
And real quick, Zoe, I'm going to jump in on that.
Yeah.
Cyber insurance has been blowing up in 2021, so I just really want to drive this point home. We're seeing cyber insurance questionnaires come out from cyber insurers to all of our clients or people who may not have really put much effort or thought into getting a cyber policy in the past. And they're kind of being blindsided with, oh, wow, now they're asking me if I do these 20 things on this checklist, I'm not going to be covered or my premium's going to go up or something like that. And exactly what you have listed here are very common questions: multi-factor authentication, data backup and recovery, user education. All of those are questions on these insurance questionnaires or these risk assessments they're sending out. So I highly encourage you, as another takeaway from the call today, if you first of all, if you don't have a cyber policy today, you should probably go talk to your insurance provider and look at your options. But if you do and a renewal is coming up, go work with your insurance provider today. Get the list of questions ahead of time, right? If they're going to start requiring multi-factor authentication or some of these other items, we can definitely get the ball rolling on that. It's much better to know about that ahead of time than trying to implement these in a rush because your insurance provider gave you a 30-day deadline or something like that. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Great call out.
yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
So, as we kind of recap what we're looking at in that process of deploying a zero trust access solution, I want to reiterate that this is a process. It's not a single project. You can definitely, you want to scope and get your team together as early as possible, plan out what your path is going to be, but don't expect to kind of be one and done and have a zero trust based access solution in place. You are going to prioritize your crown jewel assets, expand out from there. But one of the things I want to highlight is that you are building on your previous successes as you go through this. You are building a more comprehensive inventory of users and devices that can be enrolled into future integrations, applications and policies that you can apply to future integrations. You'll have your proxies already in place for those where a proxy is necessary or a connector is necessary. You'll have a better way to gauge trustworthiness, and you can implement something like a single sign-on page, which Duo can provide you or you can use from other IDP vendors, that's going to centralize and simplify access for your users to all of the resources they're connecting to. To tie this all together visually in an access attempt, you can see that a user goes to log in. We're evaluating that user's device to see if it should be trusted. They're going through that single sign-on, which now is going to federate their access to both local and hosted tools through the policies that you've implemented. If you're making use of Duo's network gateway, this can even be internal tools from external sources without the requirement of a VPN layer. The Duo network gateway basically being a reverse proxy front-ended with that Duo authentication. So this is going to help you get a more holistic view on access, not just validating that user with the implementation of multi-factor. So if you would start by deploying multi-factor, building that inventory of devices and applications, defining your tiers and granular policies, deploying access proxies so that you can cover all use cases within your environment, and finally, building out those security incident profiles to deploy analytics and get better anomaly detection. Thank you. That's my part. Hopefully you're not too tired of hearing me talk. And I think that we should have some questions coming in. So John, how are we looking?
We do have a couple questions, and I think if you go back to the last slide, it might actually help with some of these. So I'm going to kick this first one to you, actually, Zoe. You might have a lot of these conversations, um, but we had somebody asking about they have MFA rolled out to their high risk users, but they're getting pushback to roll it out to anyone else in the organization. Um, what are your thoughts on that, or what's the best approach to maybe get management or executives on your side?
So I'm gonna give the kind of first duo answer that comes to mind first, which is push. Push is kind of that James Bond moment, I think, for a lot of folks where they're anticipating, a bunch of tokens either on their phone or on their keychain that they're going to have to deal with. And a lot of times, even folks that are initially resistant to using their phone or tablet to authenticate, when they see folks around them and see how easy it is for them to just get that authentication request and approve it, that can help. Also, going back to that idea of tailoring for usability, finding that right balance of security and convenience for users. So, you can reduce that friction by making use of remember me policies, whether that is for a couple hours or for a day, whether that is for specific, maybe lower priority or lower sensitivity tools like a team lunch and learn schedule calendar, right? Versus something like production access for administrators. You're likely going to want to prompt every time that the admin goes to make a change, and not necessarily as somebody goes to check out what is going to be discussed next week. So that is a tool that can help you out there. Um, the education campaign can help you out there. But really kind of, I'm not a fan of the hamburger health plan, which is, you wait until you have a heart attack and then you start worrying about your health. That's not the way that I like to position security. I don't like to lead, whether in conversations with audiences or conversations with executives, with the idea of the sky can fall, the sky will fall if we don't do this over enough time. I like to think of it more as talking about the asset of trust that your business has and could potentially compromise the value of. There is a monetary value in the trust that your organization has with its employees and that your business has with your customers, clients, and the public at large. You can see that there is a massive reputation cost in the event of a breach, but further, you can build on that positive reputation by modeling great behavior, by making sure that you deploy multi-factor across your organization, by making sure that you're following those best practices and not just checking the boxes, and by making sure that you're following kind of best practices, such as, when you've got a security issue, making sure that you've got a strong remediation program in place and ideally a way of divulging or disclosing how you fix that issue. So hopefully I didn't go too far off on a tangent there, but in terms of building that success case, I say, always find that champion, find that fan, because you're gonna find somebody who digs it, who gets it, who's not gonna have trouble with it. And whether that is, somebody within your individual teams, your sales team, your HR team who can talk about it with your coworkers when you're not in the room, or whether that's, a member of the executive team, whether your CIO or CISO can kind of help make that case and model that good behavior. Those would be where I'd start at. And then, for specific objections or help, I would reach out to your Marco contacts. They've probably fielded that question before too.
Yeah, absolutely all the time. Thanks, Zoe. Yeah, I guess I like telling stories too, and I guess my team at Marco is responsible for handling incidents. Right, when a client has a security issue going on, it's my team that gets involved, and I something like 90 to 95% of the incidents we work are an account compromise, right? Somebody lost their password, they didn't have MFA in place, and now an attacker has access to an email inbox or VPN or your network. Um, if you think of that, 95% of what we're seeing, I mean, that's a couple hundred a year. Uh, MFA can really stop that at the door. And it not only stops that, but with something like Duo Push, it actually notifies your user that, hey, somebody's trying to log into your account. Is this a valid authentication? Yes or no? And you can say, no, it's not. Send that to my security team to investigate because somebody probably has my password. Um, so absolutely, we see MFA stop fraudulent logins every day, and we unfortunately see it quite often too, where something like Duo's not in place and the account gets compromised. So it's a it's a very critical tool, honestly, definitely to get on your remote access and your web-based apps to start with, right? The slide we've got up is where to start. That's where we want to start. Our high-risk applications, our high-risk users, but really every user in your organization is high risk. They all have access to some sort of proprietary information. So getting that rolled out to all your users, all your applications, and then building upon that, as Zoe kind of talked about, building on your maturity and better defining your policies and your risk, your adaptive risk policies and things like that. So another question was asked about mobile device management. Does that go along well with MFA? I would say it absolutely does go along well. It's not necessarily a requirement, but by having a mobile device management policy, and Zoe, I don't know if you can talk more about this, but you can do things like posture checking or risk-based policies. So you can say, hey, is this a trusted device or is this a known device to my organization? If it is, maybe I'm going to allow it to have a little bit more access, or maybe only do an MFA prompt if it's not a managed device or something like that. We can work, we can play, MFA and MDM play really well together as to making sure we're authenticating the user strongly.
Yep. I would echo that. I would say, it depends on what the needs of your mobile security strategy are. Duo has a lot of MDM-like functionality in our device insight, where we're gathering that security hygiene kind of a fingerprint at the point of access. Now, there's a lot of advantages there. By being that sort of last door that users pass through after primary authentication, but before they reach that resource, it means that we're able to have a really widespread impact quickly, but that visibility only happens at the point that a login occurs. So anytime that user goes through a login event, even if they're remembered and they're not being prompted to log in again, that's when we're getting that visibility. MDM obviously is going to be able to give you that visibility on demand, as well as do a lot of other things that would require having an agent installed, like side-loading applications, in many cases, remote wiping. And so those are things that Duo is not going to do. Now, the advantage in having Duo is that you are getting universal visibility because it's not reliant on that agent. We've got a story from a healthcare provider that had 30,000 deployed devices with MDM in place. And when we introduced Device Insight, they were already an MFA customer. They said, you know what, we're set. We've got it through our whole environment. We told them, give it a try. You've already got these users enrolled. We'll flip it on for you to see. And they found nearly the same number of devices, another 30,000, logging into protected applications that did not have MDM enabled. And it wasn't any of the well-secured internal applications, but for those hosted applications where they had a limited ability to implement their policies, those users were doing the convenient thing and logging in from their own devices. So now you're able to get that basic level of visibility universally, and then that can either potentially fill the role of MDM if you just need that basic hygiene coverage, or it can work alongside your MDM if you have kind of an expanded use case where you need that deeper level of visibility and control than an agent can provide.
Thanks, Zoe. We're going to move on. We've got a lot of good questions rolling in and want to make sure we get to all of them.
Awesome.
What would one do if their phone or whatever their authentication method was, if that were like stolen or lost in a time-sensitive situation? So let's say they're presenting in 30 minutes or an hour and they just lost their phone. what can we do to get them access in an emergency?
So I'm going to start with preparation, right? Because we'll always take preparation over remediation if it's an option. Duo supports multiple enrolled authentication devices as long as it fits for your security strategy, because we aren't going to speak on what's best for your organization. I encourage you to consider allowing your users to enroll more than one authentication device. The reason being, if I only have my phone enrolled and I leave and I go to work one day, now we are falling back in most cases to the level of a successful social engineering attack, right? Because I'm reaching out to the help desk, probably through an email ticket or a phone callback. And now an attacker just needs to leverage a successful attack against that email or phone-based system, and they could potentially get access. Now, if I've got a YubiKey token on my keychain, or I'm using Touch ID through a WebAuthn integration on my laptop, even better. Now I'm still able to get access. Not only that, but I'm able to contact the help desk and be validated by a push request by that help desk agent, because that's one of the tools that we have in place. So if there is a backup device enrolled, you also have the option of doing a more secure authentication of that user. So if the user, however, doesn't have another device enrolled and they're locked out, you do have a couple of options from a help desk standpoint. You can generate temporary bypass codes, either single use or multi-use, and either a single or a batch of them. Or you can set a user to bypass. Obviously, I would always recommend the former rather than the latter, but we have both available.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question I've got here is there expected integration with Meraki products? Yes, there's integrations today with Meraki products. So Duo has a lot of integration methods. They can integrate with many of your cloud-based applications, but they also have the on-premise proxies. So if there's anything using legacy authentication, and I don't want to get too technical here, but LDAP or Radius or something like that, we can definitely get a Duo proxy deployed and get those applications protected by MFA also. Um, you can certainly reach out to your account rep here at Marco, and we can have a further design discussion around what exactly you're looking to protect in your environment. But Zoe, I don't know if you have anything you want to add there.
No, I would just add, we talked about complexity being a challenge, and I think the trend that you can see over the last several years is that a lot of these single point solutions have spread their wings to cover either multiple problems or integrating multiple feeds together. So if you're looking for the direction of Duo, you can see that our philosophy has always been to use the data that's there as effectively as possible. And so we have already done a number of new and expanded Cisco integrations since our acquisition, but you're going to see that trend continue because something like 85% of businesses have a Cisco hardware or software presence. That's the data that's already there. And so the better that we can tie that in, the more intelligent we can make that feedback, the better we can give you visibility and control over your environment in a easily top-down way, the better off you're going to be.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is it common to see Duo deployed for network logins versus application level logins, or are you seeing it in both? And I think I'll start with that. We are seeing it. I will say it's far more common to see it on web-based applications and remote access into networks. And frankly, if you don't have it today, that's where I'm going to recommend you start. That being said, there's a lot more focus around network-based logins too. So your individual devices, as you go and log into a server or a computer or some other workstation or personal device, um, there's a lot more focus around that. Insurance, again, is a driver for that. They're starting to ask the question of whether you have that protected by MFA. A lot of these regulatory frameworks are requiring it now. CMMC launched or went into effect relatively recently. That is requiring it. So it's becoming more and more common to see it on the individual systems also.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in terms of avoiding an application by application prompted login, you can also protect endpoints, those laptops and desktops at the point of login. We are a Microsoft partner and tied in as a third-party authenticator. So you see that same Duo login flow when you're logging in, whether you have the option rather when setting up RDP, whether that's only for remote logins or also for local workstation. There's even support for an offline login mode, since logging into a workstation is one of those few use cases where you may still be looking to do an authentication even if there is no active network connection.
Awesome. I think that is what we have for questions at the moment. I'll give people a few more minutes to type any other questions they might have based on the content today or any other conversation we just had. Um, I guess any last comments or thoughts, Zoe, as we wait.
Uh, I would say that one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we get from folks that are evaluating is that they didn't anticipate the simplicity of getting started. They were planning a project in terms of days or weeks, and they found that they could get it set up in minutes or hours. Actually, a lot of times, we can help folks when you're working with your representative on getting your trial up and running well before you make the decision to buy. We want you to get to see in your environment if it's going to do what you need it to do before you own it. So if you're on the fence, we have a demo site, demo.duo.com, where you can try out some of the integrations that you may see in your environment. I would encourage you to reach out to your Marco representative who's going to be able to help get you connected with further resources and technical resources. But pick out a use case. You get 30-day access to the full feature set, and you'll be able to get a small group of users enrolled without affecting the login experience for the rest of your users.